is getting more and more a country of transition to the north. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bianca. I'm now going to pass to May Ifabro. I'm now going to pass to May Ifabro. She's a board member of the Philippine Commission on Women and a coordinator of the Young Women's Collective and Women's Health Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, UN Women and Columbia University, for inviting the Philippine delegation to share our experience as one of the leading exporters of women globally. As of 2013, 6,142 overseas Filipino workers live daily, with more than half of them women. And 6 out of 10 of those women are young women, aged 15 to 34 years old. Now, the feminization of labor migration is most marked in the changes in the 1990s, when there was a rapid increase from less than half of our migrant workers, women, to more than half now are women. With the intense policies in terms of supporting, protecting, as well as encouraging export policy. And daily, about 500 new young women are hired to leave the country. Now, the top 3 areas of countries of destination, unfortunately, Italy is not one of them. For women, is situated in the Middle East, so the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Hong Kong. So you can just imagine the kinds of jobs that women are engaged in, and 55% are laborers and unskilled workers. Yet, despite our large numbers, the remittances of migrant female workers comprised only 32% of the total 165.6 billion in 2012. Now, this is reflective of the lower pay they receive. So why feminization of overseas labor? Now, when you say feminization of migration or feminization of migrant work, you would have to look at it in various arenas, in the different, the cross-cutting levels and spaces in terms of migration, looking at the causes of migration, looking at the recruitment process, how they are engaged in this the transition, traveling, at work, the status of their work, what kind of work, where they are working, the remuneration and benefits that they are experiencing, and the bargaining and negotiation opportunities that are available to them. With regards to protection, with regards to reintegration or the exit strategies, as well as looking at those they have left behind. So it is important that when we ask the question, the gender dynamics of migration, if you ask the women themselves, and they share their stories of loss, struggle, triumphs, and resistance, the negative definitely far outweighs the positive. There are success stories, and I think if you ask any Filipino, all of us have family out there. The first member of my family to leave our country was my aunt, and she left and she worked in the United Kingdom to become one of the nurses there. And eventually, her family was able to follow, but it was quite a long time. And I was raising my cousins, my young female cousins during that time. And it was very difficult. And when I went to visit them, I saw how even more difficult it was to raise children, daughters at that, in a space that is also unfamiliar to you. And those are good stories. When the women who leave are able to find decent jobs, are able to integrate with their families, are able to provide more opportunities for the children, but then there are more stories of horror, of loss, of pain. One organization that we work with in PCW is the Center for Migrant Advocacy, and they brought out in their communication with female migrant workers, they were able to solicit some information, and they said that there was freedom, in the space that the new country would provide, the destination country, where they can be whomever they want to be, because the constraints and the realities of the barriers to be who you are in your own countries, in these spaces you're someone new. You can be who you want to be. The possibilities are endless. you become emancipated from the roles that previously you were compelled to do back home. You become a breadwinner, providing financial security to your family, sometimes not even to your family, but to your whole community. It is not unknown that in the Philippines, we have OFW villages, basically communities, we call them barangays. You have villages that are predominantly migrant families. And we have a story that you would know which kind of work or which kinds of migrant workers are in these communities based on the kinds of houses that they're able to build. So if you have some from members of our seafarers, they would have houses with windows that are round because it would help the family men, the men, to be able to transition easily. With women, it was different. You would see if it's a female migrant worker, they would be creating compounds, taking care of their whole clan. So it is it is interesting because you see how the opportunities that it provides, not just the migrant worker, the female migrant worker, but the rest of her family and her community would have. There is a space for personal development and increased female and agency independence, and the freedom to make substantial decisions on their own and on behalf of their family. Nevertheless, the negative aspects were seen as, of course, anxiety, depression, development of dependence among the family. So mendicancy is very strong as well. The drastic change of lifestyle. There is a concept now, the nouveau rich. You would know which families are suddenly being able to have access to more liquid assets. Now, the change of lifestyle for family members and the migrant worker, financial excesses, privileges that previously were there, indebtedness and long working hours leading to mental, physical, and health problems, reinforcement of the gendered roles of Filipino migrant workers, racism, sexism, social exclusion, and social discrimination. Like I mentioned earlier, for the women migrant workers, the negative aspects of migration currently and definitely outweigh the positive. And it is necessary for them to continue to highlight the vulnerabilities and recurrent problems in the migration cycle. But on their own, and even in the absence of measures provided by the host country as well as the country of origin, women migrant workers have been able to resist the unjust working conditions, finding solidarity amongst themselves, learning and discovering their leadership potential. It is really in company where you thrive. And when they share their stories of triumph, struggle, and resistance, they find that sense of belonging, that sense of community. Knowingly and unknowingly, they organize themselves. In the presence of non-government organizations and civil society organizations working on migration has really paved the ground also for these women to further capacitate themselves. There is a reference to balcony talks for those women who are immobilized. They cannot leave their houses, so they talk to each other through the balconies. So they find ways. And then it reminds us of the irreverence of women, to break glass ceilings. And so churches and apartments, the church in this instance is an ally for migrant workers, are used for forms of resistance where migrant workers can organize and participate in public activities to know, to understand, to claim, and to demand their rights. Now, these spaces provide a security not just for those who are documented migrants, but even for those who are undocumented. Now, beyond the absolute numbers, I mentioned around 6,000 in a day, there are specific vulnerabilities. Although I agree, it is a status in itself. Being a migrant is already making you vulnerable. But being a woman and a migrant further compounds that vulnerability. And that is why Filipino overseas workers face, because they are women, sexual discrimination and other gender-specific abuses, exploitation and violence. The surge and the demand for caregivers or nurses are mostly for women, about women. And also the sorts of work where they tend to predominate. Especially this is the case because the work perpetuates the traditionally defined reproductive roles of women in society as domestic workers, caregivers, nurses, etc. that often are not commensurate to their experience, to their capacities, to their skills. Now, in reference to this, the status of female migrant workers, especially if they are living domestic workers in their host countries, especially for live-in female workers, are even made more vulnerable because most often than not, they work in unregulated spaces. There is also new mechanisms wherein called the kafala system and the Gulf Cooperation Council, wherein countries and top destination of female OFWs will tie. Kafala is a system that ties the migrant workers to the individual employers. So there's a sense of utang na loob, or a deepening dependence and a loss of power. And so if the woman is unable to negotiate and bargain and demand for her right and autonomy, then she would be tied to this employer, even in times of duress. Now, these compounding identities, because they are women, crises, increases vulnerability, and the onslaught of the global economic and financial crisis further intensified the abuses and violations faced by women OFWs. They made the women even more vulnerable to illegal recruitments, human and sex trafficking, criminalization of the irregular and undocumented, and tolerate abuses at power. Humbly, I would like to present to you one situation in the Philippines which propelled a participatory gender audit amongst all frontline agencies in the country, when in 2013, there was an alleged scheme that was unraveled about officials in destination countries from the Philippines who were sexually abusing the female OFWs in their care. This was called the Sex for Flight controversy. I present this to you because the Philippines is constantly and humbly assessing and evaluating our mechanism, and we recognize the need to propel change, especially capacitate and demand accountability from our frontline services in terms of gender sensitizing them, as well as providing referral mechanisms for access to justice for those who have been abused. One gap in one striking incident in reference to gender dynamics in migration is the young women and girls that are left behind. Now, this scenario actually perpetuates the discrimination and violation of women's and girls' human rights. Why is that? There is a rise in incest cases in OFW families wherein the mother would leave and unknowingly, because of the strong context in our country, the young girls take on the roles of their mother, including being the substitute spouses at times. And in these scenarios, provides a different color and context to the loss brought about and the social costs of migration to women and girls. We have a gazillion policies. we always adapt and change, but one of the latest, the most recent in terms of when we evaluated our work is on the discussion in the Migrants in Countries in Crisis initiative. Now, this initiative is in response to the call to provide safety and protection for those migrants caught in natural disaster and armed conflict in both their countries of destination as well as their host countries. Now, this initiative, it's a discussion that needs to happen because right now we have stories also of women who are caught in the crossfires of these of armed conflict in their countries of destination. Now, yes. How much time? 0 minutes. 0 minutes. It's a good thing I can expand time. But we can tell you more about the work that we do, but what we want to emphasize is that we have different agencies. We have a broad base of agencies, national agencies that are working in partnership also with other countries of destination to make sure that there are protection and referral mechanisms in place. Nevertheless, because we recognize it is a cross-cutting issue, nevertheless, this also provides a check and balance, no? Across the agencies involved. But what is important is that despite these changes, despite these policies and programs, we recognize that there is a need to address the fundamentals to structural causes of migration: labor, lack of employment, disaster, climate change, conflict, development aggression, forced migration, and the others. A colleague of mine will be speaking about it more later this afternoon. And what is needed is really a comprehensive program to provide locally generated employment, one that is not dependent on international or foreign economies, which are also very much susceptible to severe crises. And I think if you ask the women also, there is a need to expand protection mechanisms. They came up with a long list of recommendations to provide migrant workers with